Blessed Lord, thank you for the teachers you have raised up in history. Glory be to your name, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. To turn our attention to Dr. Fesko's J. Fesko, Theology of the Westminster Standards. Conclusion: the aim of this study is to set the standards in their original historic setting and explore the world of the 17th century. Like a deep sea diver who plunges into the miry depths and must soon come up to his own world. My hope is that this brief exploration of the marvelous world of 17th century Reformed theology will be interesting, instructive, and edifying for saints living in the 21st century and beyond. Mentions David Dixon, Thomas Watson, Thomas Boston. Wow. Hodge, Williamson, Ligon Duncan, Latham. I'd like to do the Latham volume. Chad Van Dixhorn is quite a big name as well. The historical and theological context. Politics, divorce, adultery, war, espionage, treason, violence, assassination, torture, and the end of the world are ideas seldom associated with the Westminster Standards. But history tells a different story, as such events and activities were part of the world surrounding the creation of the assembly. Such ideas were not only familiar to the assembly, but in many ways part of its formation. People in church pews who take up the confession and begin to read it likely do not realize they are stepping into a period of history when the authors sometimes heard cannon fire in the background as they debated doctrine. They were writing their confession and catechism in the midst of the Civil War. The historical context is vital, therefore, to our having a fuller understanding of the standards. Another important dimension of the standards adds one significant texture and depth, is recognizing that the divines who wrote these documents were not one-dimensional Calvinists. Often, in popular and academic literature, authors apply the term Calvinism to the theology of the standards, which creates the impression that its authors were overly indebted to the theology of Calvin, or that they somehow departed from the norms that the Genevan Reformer established. In other words, Calvin is the Garden of Eden, and the Westminster Standards are the fall. The Assembly's own interaction with sources from this period easily demonstrate that such ideas are mythological rather than historical. Hence, this chapter surveys the antecedent historical and theological context that led to the formation of the Assembly and the creation of the Westminster Standards. It first explores politics and religion and the birth of the English Reformation. We then move to the subject of wars and rumors of wars, which deals with a number of key conflicts that were shaped and driven by different theologies, Protestantism versus Catholicism. Events such as the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the notorious gunpowder plot of 1605, hardly register in the minds of contemporary readers of the standards, but they were both prominent in the thought of a number of the divines. This chapter will then examine events on the continent, including the 39 Years' War, which set part of the backdrop for the birth of the Civil War being in Parliament and the creation of the Westminster Standards. The last two sections briefly explore the immediate theological context of the assembly, a theological chaos at the time, and multiple streams of influence that fed the theological interest and appetite of the assembly's participants. Given this background, the reader will be equipped with key principles that will enable a better understanding of the Westminster Standards. Politics and religion. At the regal level, the Reformation in England was not initially theologically motivated, as it was in the continent with Martin Luther's initial grievances against the Roman Catholic Church. As many know, Henry VIII challenged Luther's efforts at reforming the church and was subsequently awarded the title Defensor Fidei by the Pope. However, other things were going on in Henry's life, particularly the quest for a male heir. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was unable to give Henry a son to succeed on the throne of England. Henry had married Catherine in 1509, soon after his ascension to the throne. But as early as 1510, he was reported to have been unfaithful to her. However, a young woman by the name of Anne Boleyn caught Henry's eye, but Anne refused to consent to the king's sexual advances and told him she would settle for nothing less than being his wife. The challenge of a young, ambitious woman contributed to a chain of events that eventually led to Henry's divorce from Catherine, England's break from the Roman Catholic Church, and the creation of the Church of England with Henry as its new leader and royal head. Henry's case for his divorce was supported by the likes of Thomas Cranmer, who, among others, was interested in reform and who made the legal and theological case for the legitimacy of the king's divorce. Henry, notorious for his numerous wives in the quest for a male heir, would eventually die, and his son, born by Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, would ascend the throne. Under Edward's reign, the Reformation of England flourished. The Reformation of the Church of England proceeded far beyond Henry's nominal reforms, largely owing to the theological advisors that surrounded Henry, who, at the time of his ascension, was only 9 years old. Under Edward's reign, continental reformers such as Martin Bucer and Peter Vermigli were invited to teach at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Another continental reformer, a Polish theologian, was given charge over the London Strangers' Church, which was allowed to set up its own form of church discipline and worship. All three theologians, Bucer, Vermigli, and Alasko, spent a great deal of time with Cranmer in his home, and it was through the influence of these three that Cranmer's views on the Lord's Supper shifted and took on a decidedly reformed cast. Another influential continental theologian who carried on epistolary friendship and offered sage counsel to English reformers was Heinrich Bullinger. The capstones of the reforms under Edward's reign appeared in 1552 and 1553, with the composition and publication of the Book of Common Prayer and the 42 articles largely written by Cranmer. But during the drama of Henry's divorce, Mary, the daughter by Catherine, carefully observed her mother's mistreatment. Mary naturally was against the divorce and was very dedicated to her mother's Roman Catholic faith. The seeds of resentment sown during the divorce proceedings would later flower in the persecution of Protestants throughout England. In Mary's mind, Protestants had unjustly treated her mother, She was determined to restore the Roman Catholic faith. Upon Edward's death, Mary, also known as Bloody Mary because of her persecution of the Protestants, led England back toward Rome. This return was evidence that though the Church of England was officially reformed under Edward's reign, the Reformation had taken only among a small segment of the population. Shortly after Mary's ascension in 1553, the imperial ambassador from Spain noted how Londoners had obediently taken Easter communion according to the Roman Catholic custom. But among the Protestants, there were some who were resolutely dedicated to the Reformed faith, and more than 280 were martyred, including Cranmer, Hooper, Latimer, and Ditlas Ridley. In the wake of the Marian persecutions, more than 800 Englishmen, gentry, and ministers, and those preparing for the ministry went into exile in various Reformed cities such as Emden, Strasbourg, Zurich, Basel, and other cantons of Switzerland. When many of these exiles eventually returned to the British Isles, including theologians such as John Knox, they brought many theological ideas and plans for reformation with them. In many respects, Mary's persecution had the opposite effect upon the English Reformation than she intended. It made it stronger. After Mary's short-lived but nevertheless violent reign, she was succeeded by Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. Elizabeth was raised in the home of Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth bride. Catherine Parr was a Protestant by conviction, and her influence upon Elizabeth was significant. Moreover, if Elizabeth rejected the Protestant faith,
he'll be coming to the door.
okay,
So
when's he coming?
Between 2 and 4. Open up that.
Oh, a second. We were termite man coming. It's for the interruption. Under Elizabeth's reign, Reformed theology once again flourished, and more than half of the initial set of Elizabethan bishops came from among those who had sought exile under the Marian persecutions. The first post-Marian Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, was Matthew Parker, the executor of Martin Bucer's will, and his successor, Ed Grindal, was a pallbearer at Bucer's funeral. In Elizabeth's England, John Jewel, Apology of the Church of England, the Geneva Bible, which contained theological notes in the margin written by continental reformers, and John Fox's Acts and Monuments were all published. They were highly influential and further inculcated a new generation in the Reformed faith. They also steeled the nation's resolve regarding its chief place in the apocalyptic battle between the Church of Christ and the Roman Catholic Church, the Antichrist. In this history antecedent to the Westminster Assembly, two chief things should be noted. First, politics and religion were intertwined. The popular notion that the Reformation was strictly a religious movement, inspired by preaching alone, is closer to mythology than history. As noted earlier, history is typically messy, and such is the case with the English Reformation. While Henry likely pursued Reformation for personal benefit and his overactive libido, Others, such as Cranmer, undoubtedly had better motivations. Second, the success and progress of the Reformed faith in the 16th century were largely dependent upon the accession or demise of monarchs. In other words, in England, the Reformation largely flowed from the top to the bottom. It was not a popular democratic movement, but rather a movement driven by an oligarchy. This dynamic did not vanish like the morning mist once England crossed the threshold into the 17th century. On the contrary, this same relationship between church and state colored the reign of James I, and especially that of his son, Charles I of England. The tensions between church and state would eventually give birth to the Westminster Assembly and to regicide with the beheading of Charles. More will be said about these events below. Rumors, wars and rumors of war. For contemporary readers of the Westminster Standards, the original context is at some distance, not simply in terms of the number of centuries that have passed, but also in terms of the theological culture of early modernity. In the present, people associate religious violence with radicals, extremists, or those religions committed to spreading their belief by such means, such as Islam. But in the early modern period, consequence of the irrefragable bond between politics and religion was that religion and war were inextricably linked. Microcosm of this reality appears in the line of one of the Reformation's first generation leaders, Ulrich Zwingli. In the early days of the Reformation, a number of Swiss cities embraced the embryonic reform movement, and Zwingli encouraged them to form a political alliance, the Christian Civic Union. Zwingli's intent was not only to strengthen the bonds among the various Swiss cantons that embraced the Reformed faith, but also to reach other cities and add them to the alliance to advance the Reformation. A number of Zwingli's allies warned him about such a move because they feared reprisal by those cities still under Roman Catholic control. Zwingli and the Reformed cities fought a brief war in the summer of 1529, which was followed by the Peace of Kappel. He was somewhat successful and able to extend the influence of the Reformation among Swiss communities. Zwingli and the leaders in Zurich became overconfident and overextended themselves by imposing an economic blockade against the Catholic interstates of Switzerland. In response, the Roman Catholic cantons raised an army and marched on Zurich, routing the Protestant army. Zwingli, wearing a full suit of armor, was with the Protestant army and was killed in battle. Some have claimed that he was merely a chaplain who accompanied the army into battle. However, if he were merely a chaplain, then why would he dress in armor, wear a helmet, and carry a sword and battle axe? The tragedy of Zwingli's death is accented by its brutality. He was hunched over a dying man, consoling him, when a soldier wielding a stone struck him in the head. Zwingli packed himself up off the ground, but was hit again multiple times until he was run through with a lance. After the battle, Catholic soldiers scoured the field looking for wounded Protestants, and upon finding them, finished him. These soldiers eventually stumbled upon Zwingli, that vile heretic, rascal, that traitor, under a tree and in the throes of death. They drew a sword and cut his throat. The Catholic soldiers wanted to dismember Zwingli and send pieces of him to each of the five cantons allied with the Reformation. However, some objected, and instead he was tried. He was quartered for treason and that his body was burned for heresy. When his remains were burned, the ashes of pigs were mixed with Zwingli's dismembered body, and then the mixture was cast into the air by the mob that had gathered to watch the proceedings. Was Zwingli a minister or soldier? Was the Reformation a theological or political movement? Was the Reformation a theological or military phenomenon? The answer to these questions is yes. The Reformation was all of these things, and Zwingli's death is but one example of how interconnected and messy the events of early modernity were. As military strategist, Karl von Clausewitz has argued, stripped to its essence, war is simply the exercise of force in order to bring about a political goal. It is merely the implementation of political policy. In this case, given the symbiotic nature between church and state, war was a natural instrument for advancing and defending theological causes. And this principle generally colored Protestant and Roman Catholic interactions during early modernity. As has been noted above, under the Marian persecutions, nearly 300 martyrs died for their faith. However, this is not to say Protestants were innocent of bloodshed. Roman Catholics suffered under the Protestant rule, which was an accelerant to an already burning fires of conflict between the two parties. The animus between the Reformed and Roman Catholics was fueled by regular armed conflict, such as St. Bartholomew Day massacre. Tensions between the Reformed and Roman Catholics were running high in France. Over the years, the Reformed faith had spread quickly. Between 1555 and 1570, approximately 1,240 churches were planted in France, and about 10% of the French population vowed its allegiance to the Reformed faith. With the untimely death of the French king Henry VIII, power passed to his widow, Catherine Medici. Political unrest marked Catherine's reign, and coupled with religious strife between the Reformed and Roman Catholics, a number of brief wars broke out. The first war, occurring between 1562 and 63, was instigated by the massacre of unarmed Huguenots, adherents to the Roman faith. An attempt by Protestants in 1567-68 to seize power failed, leading to another conflict between Huguenots and Roman Catholics, in which Huguenots were unsuccessful. Catherine and her son, Charles IX, who had ascended the throne at 10, was convinced that the way to end the strife was to carry out a series of assassinations against Huguenot leaders. At 4 a.m. on Sunday, August 23, 1572, Roman Catholics in and around Paris began breaking into Huguenot homes and killing anyone found inside. The massacre went on for 2 days, and at least 3,000 were killed in Paris. Approximately another 3,000 were killed in the surrounding provinces in the final week. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the Marian persecution of Protestants in England, and the Spanish Inquisition would be recalled, recounted, and seared into the collective memory of Protestants across Europe for generations to come, and as such set the broader context for Reformed Roman Catholic conflict in England, which played a part in creating the Westminster Assembly. Collective memories are much shorter in the contemporary period than they were in early modernity. For many today, the Second World War, or even the terrorists' attack on the United States of September 9/11, are but a distant memory. But such amnesia was not the case for the English Reformed. In a sermon preached on July 18, 1644, before both houses of Parliament, Scottish divine Alexander Henderson invoked the deliverances from the Armada and the powder treason to remind his audience how God had delivered England from the machinations of the Roman Catholic foes. Henderson was referring to England's victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 and the infamous Gunpowder Plot of 1605, events that were 56 and 39 years before, but in the minds of many, ever-present realities and reminders of the continuing threat of Romanism and the need for reformation in England. Remember, theology, politics, war, and matters of national security were inseparably entangled. Conflict between Spain, a Roman Catholic nation, and England, a Protestant nation under Queen Elizabeth, was ultimately rooted in King Henry's convoluted line of successors to his throne. Under Mary's rule, Spain and England had good relations, given her commitment to Roman Catholicism, her persecution of Protestants, and the Spanish blood that coursed through her veins. As mentioned above, Mary's mother was Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand II, Queen Isabella of Spain, who was famous for underwriting Christopher Columbus's journey to the New World. When Mary died and Elizabeth ascended to the throne, many were eager to roll back the influence of Catholicism, as well as curtail Spanish political power and influence on English soil. Elizabeth diligently balked at the marital advances of King Henry II of Spain when he suggested that Elizabeth replace her half-sister in the marriage bed. He had been married to Bloody Mary in an attempt to solidify the political and theological alliance between England and Spain. But it soon became evident that Elizabeth had no intention of marrying Philip, and so it came to represent everything that he detested. Protestant bastard queen who was repressing Roman Catholics under her rule, encouraging piracy against Spanish shipping, and assisting Protestant rebels against Philip's war in the Netherlands. Bring it to a close here. Lord God, you're the president of all the commotions and wars in history. We simply bow speechlessly before your majesty. Blessed be your name, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.